So in the next few slides, I will run through the key identification features of this invasive plant. I'm also going to mention 3 other plants that commonly can be mistaken for floating pennywort. They're very bright green, and certainly in autumn and winter they can be the only very bright green plant growing while our native species are dying back, so that makes them easier to spot. The leaves are waxy. You can see in the photo that the water droplets are sitting on the surface of the leaf. They're kidney shaped and they can grow up to 7 centimetres across. Looking closely at each leaf, they're deeply lobed, and this lobe goes right back to the central stem. They also have highly crinkled edges. Two main growth forms of the floating pennywort leaves. You get those that are floating flat on the water surface, which you can see on the right, and then you also get the emergent leaves, where the leaves are held on their stems several centimetres above the water surface. Taken in the laboratory, you can see really clearly on this photo the fleshy, very pale stems, and also that there are numerous fine roots. This is along the stem, on the part of the stem that is below the water surface, and they'll be easy to see, within the water. There are also roots that will eventually go into the bank and anchor it into the bank. Floating pennywort can grow free floating, but when it's established, it will be rooted into the margins. When a small leaf breaks off, and it can regrow from thumbnail size fragments if it catches in marginal vegetation or on a branch of a tree that's overhanging into the watercourse, it will then start to grow there, and you'll see leaves being formed and roots, but eventually it will grow back into the bank. Pennywort rafts themselves are like icebergs. Underneath the water there is a network of dense stems, and then above the water the leaves that you more commonly see. So the photograph on the left shows a very newly established floating pennywort raft. All the leaves are just floating on the surface. They're all quite small. The one on the right shows one that's further on in the summer. It's been growing for a long time, and it has a mixture of floating leaves at the edge of the raft and then the much denser packed leaves that are emergent over the rest of the raft area. It can be easily confused with this watercress. The picture on the left here shows watercress as it's beginning to grow in the margins of a stream. It's not yet fully emergent, so it does look very much like a floating pennywort. The picture on the right is a close-up, and in this picture you can see that the leaf arrangement, so how the leaves grow on the stems, is very different. There's multiple leaves to each stem, and the leaves are much rounder without that deep lobe than on the floating pennywort. Another species that's easy to confuse with floating pennywort is fool's watercress. Looking at the picture on the right, I hope you can see that the fool's watercress has its leaves arranged in opposite pairs along the stem. And the third plant that I want to mention, that we've had quite a few samples sent in for identification, is ground ivy. Ground ivy is actually a terrestrial plant, and these photos have been taken in my garden. But when it's growing on the top of the riverbank and it starts to grow back down the bank towards the water, it's very easy to think that it could be early growth of floating pennywort. The leaves are broadly kidney shaped and they are quite deeply lobed. But the arrangement of the leaves on the stem, so how they're attached to the stem, and they're not as crinkly as floating pennywort leaves when you look up close. If you're out and about and you see a plant that you think is floating pennywort, if it's safe to do so, please take a photograph of it and then send it to us via iRecord. This will mean that me or one of my colleagues will be able to identify it and let you know via iRecord, what the actual species is, and that will be really helpful for us. To finish my talk, so the leaves are either floating or emergent. They're kidney-shaped and waxy. They're deeply lobed and have very crinkly edge. The stems are pale and fleshy, and they have numerous fine roots on the stems that are below the water, and you can see those in the bottom of this photograph. Floating pennywort grows extremely rapidly under ideal growth conditions. It will grow up to 20 centimetres a day. Ideal conditions are when it's warm, when the water's warm, when there's plenty of sunlight, and when there's plenty of nutrients within the water. In fact, it keeps on growing until temperatures drop, and it isn't really knocked back until we've had several hard frosts over a winter. And as I said before, the floating pennywort rafts are rather like icebergs, so they have a huge amount of stems and roots below the surface, as well as the emergent and floating leaves above the water.